If you've been around the investment space for some time, you've probably heard terms like growth or value being thrown around. These are just labels we put on stocks to group them together, say, hey, this is similar to this, and these are some of the attributes it has. Specifically with value stocks, which is what we're covering today, they have a few key attributes. Generally, their PE is cheap. Maybe they don't grow as much, although we'll dive into some that have grown well. And where the term value comes from is saying, hey, the value of this stock is worth more than where it's at right now. Although generally that's super subjective, so that's not really the term I like. What I look for a value stock is generally one thing. It is, well, one, it's profitable. Two, it's under the S&P 500 PE. Now that is also subjective because maybe S&P is doing really bad, but generally it's not. Generally, the S&P 500 is kind of like the middle ground for all stocks are. So high growth stocks will be above it, value stocks will be under it. Now, of course, there's many exceptions, and we're going to dive into those. But that's what I'm looking for mainly. Is it a growing company? And then is its PE valued below the S&P 500? And it doesn't necessarily have to be growing, but mostly profitable. So Caterpillar is an example of one, and it's one of my favorite value stocks, right? 18.5 PE, that's significantly under the S&P 500 of 27. And it's grown really well. Last 5 years, up 180%. That's doubled the S&P 500 performance. However, with almost every single value stock, there's a reason the PE is fairly low, and you have to find it, right? Because it's either going to be it isn't grown as well, specifically Caterpillar has, so that isn't why it is, or there's some sentiment around it. With Caterpillar specifically, a lot of growth has been in China. China has a huge housing, huge infrastructure market there. They just do a bunch of that. So they had a lot of growth in that, and they're not really expected to grow next year. So that's part of the reason it's like, okay, we're only up, or we're not really expected to grow much more, so we're kind of going to stay right here. But there's a good chance it does at least decently well. And even if it doesn't, you're still way cheaper than the S&P 500. So you got some wiggle room there. Another example, most financial institutions will be below the S&P 500 average. However, that doesn't necessarily mean they're cheap, because you have to understand that all of these financial institutions, whether it be Morgan Stanley, Wells Fargo, almost all of them trade the large ones, at least between 10 and 20 PE. So it's cheap, but you also have to say, okay, cheap compared to what? S&P 500? Sure, but none of these stocks are going to trade above S&P 500. It's very, very rare. Maybe it'll be, probably decades. Maybe never, right? Because of, the regulations put on these specific companies, for better or for worse. I'm not here to debate that, but this one is cheap, compared to the S&P 500, but it's not really cheap compared to its peers. So you have to factor that in as well. Logitech's another example of one. It's maybe even more extreme than Caterpillar. Up from 15%, that's not quite accurate. Early 2015, up from, about 15 still, up to where we're at 85 today. It is below S&P 500 average, and its dividends also good, like Caterpillar's was. However, like you said, with the other one, there's a reason for this, and it's because growth isn't expected to be great. They've done very, very well. They've gotten to things like Walmart over the last decade. They've done very well, but also a lot of them have a ceiling capped on them. For example, NVIDIA. You've all heard of NVIDIA. It's done very, very well. We all know that. Logitech will never do what NVIDIA did. Same with Caterpillar. There's just the ceiling's capped there, and you don't expect the stocks to do that. But when you're holding an AMD or a Vertiv, or even like a SoFi, right? You can, I don't think SoFi, I don't hate SoFi, but the example is the ceiling that you're looking at is much higher. With most of these value stocks, certainly with Morgan Stanley as well, there is a clear ceiling cap to it where you're never going to 3x in 1 year unless you're like super cheap and undervalued. But generally that's not going to happen. You also have to be careful. Oftentimes industries, have a certain this is a value industry, right? Or, Walmart is going to do decent during a recession. You could say it's a recession hedge as well. However, you have to look at the value of the company. Something like Target or Kroger is decent. It's a value stock. However, in the exact same industry, Walmart, 38 PE right now, this is not a value stock. I don't hate Walmart. I think it's fine. But this is a growth stock. It has to be because it's grown well. And also, it's so much above the S&P 500. You couldn't say this is value. It's not. It's not. That doesn't mean it's not a valuable company. It doesn't mean it's not a good company. But if you're having this as like, oh, this is a value hedge, Walmart's not that. It's just not. So you have to be careful with that. And then another thing, stocks can fall into multiple categories. I like to differentiate value and dividend-centric stocks. That doesn't mean they can't be it. I mean, also, Coca-Cola is not that much below the S&P 500 in terms of PE, but it still is, technically. It's below S&P 500. But to me, this is much more of a dividend stock because you're mainly going to get your returns from it through dividends. So that doesn't mean that dividend stocks aren't also value stocks. I just personally put the label dividend stock on them. That's what fits more in my brain, right? If you want to do it elsewhere, you can. And like I said, multiple can fall in these too. You could probably categorize Caterpillar as growth, or specifically Logitech as growth and value because it's grown really well. And it's also under S&P 500. So these things can fit into multiple categories, or something rare like I just spitballing here, but McDonald's generally doesn't fall into any. It's not a great dividend, hasn't grown enough, and is not cheap enough, right? And that doesn't mean it's a bad company either, but it doesn't really fall into any of those really well. So hopefully that covered what value stocks are. Oh, I'll dive into one more thing here. Generally, you're hedging to protect yourself a little bit more in terms of a downturn. Generally, value stocks are going to do better during a downturn because they're cheaper. So, for example, something like Vertiv. I like Vertiv, think it's a fine company. I also like Caterpillar, right? If there's a recession, Vertiv is going to get hit a lot harder, even if Vertiv is going to do better, just because the value of the PE. People are going to be like, oh crap, I don't want to hold into high PE companies. These are bad during a recession, so they sell more. And Caterpillar will still go down. All stocks go down during recession. You can see, at least in COVID, it fell during that time period, right? But it didn't fall a crazy amount. I mean, 148 to 99, that seems crazy, but lots of them fell more than 50%. So anyways, I think I've covered most of what I wanted to in this video. Some basics around value stocks. If you have any questions, leave them down in the comment section. I appreciate you for watching. If you enjoyed, leave a like and subscribe. I'll catch you next time.